He was smiling, right up until he read the note. The steak was perfect. The room was warm. Money laughed at every table. Then the fork stopped. The waitress had already walked away. She didn't wait to see his reaction. She didn't say a word. She just slipped the truth onto the table and disappeared back into the noise. They spit in your food. In that moment, the smile didn't fade. It collapsed. What no one in that restaurant knew was that the man they ignored, seated near the kitchen doors, dressed like he didn't belong, owned the building, the brand, and every decision that had ever protected them. And what started as a quiet dinner was about to become a reckoning. Not because of anger, not because of revenge, but because one woman chose truth over safety. And one man finally chose to stop watching. If you've ever watched something wrong happen and wondered what you would do, tap like, subscribe, and please help us reach 1,000 subscribers. You're part of this journey. Stay with us. This story gets heavier before it gets hopeful. Malcolm Devo learned early that visibility was a double-edged blade. As a boy, being seen too clearly meant being judged before he spoke. Teachers assumed less. Security guards watched longer. Strangers asked questions that sounded polite but carried suspicion underneath. So Malcolm learned a skill that would later save his life and build his empire. He learned how to disappear in plain sight. At 46, Malcolm was one of the most powerful CEOs in America. His name moved markets. His decisions shifted thousands of jobs with a signature. He sat on boards that shaped policy, funded innovation, and quietly influenced elections without ever needing to step behind a podium. But power had never erased memory. It only sharpened it. That was why he didn't arrive in Charleston on a private jet. He came on a commercial flight, window seat, no assistant, no driver waiting at the gate. He wore a navy hoodie with frayed cuffs, dark jeans, and beat-up sneakers he'd owned for years. Not because he couldn't afford better, because clothes decided how much of the truth people were willing to show you. Malcolm wasn't here for dinner. He was here because 2 weeks earlier, an anonymous message had landed in his private inbox, an address only a handful of people in the world knew. Your restaurant isn't what you think it is. People are getting hurt, especially people who look like you. No demands, no threats, just facts. And a warning. Most executives would have sent lawyers, PR teams, quiet settlements. Malcolm didn't. He believed systems revealed their true nature only when they thought no one important was watching. So he watched. The restaurant, the cradle, sat inside a restored historic mansion, all charm and prestige. Candlelight glowed against polished wood. Valets moved with rehearsed precision, the kind of place where people lowered their voices automatically as if money itself demanded reverence. The hostess glanced at Malcolm's clothes, then at her tablet. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked. "No," he said calmly. She sighed, just slightly, and smiled without warmth. "We're fully booked, but I can seat you near the service area." Malcolm nodded. "That's fine." She led him past tables dressed in white linen and wealth. Laughter spilled from wine glasses. Not a single black customer in sight. Plenty of black staff, though. Always present. Always invisible. He was seated near the kitchen doors. No candle. No greeting smile. Just a menu placed down like an obligation. Malcolm didn't mind. This was exactly what he'd come for. 10 minutes passed. No server. He counted every swing of the kitchen door, every glance that slid past him, and landed somewhere else. When the waiter finally arrived, there was no apology, just a bored question. "Ready?" "Yes," Malcolm said, already knowing what he'd order. When he spoke the name of the steak, the most expensive item on the menu, the waiter hesitated, just a fraction of a second, long enough to register disbelief. "Medium rare," Malcolm added, "and a glass of the Staglin Cabernet." The waiter blinked, then nodded stiffly and walked away. Across the room, a manager watched him. Malcolm felt the eyes, heavy with calculation. Good, he thought. Watch me back. What Malcolm didn't see, what he couldn't see yet, was the woman standing just inside the kitchen, her hands steady but her chest tight with something close to fear. Naomi Brooks had worked at the cradle for 8 months, long enough to know the rules that weren't written down. Smile more, speak less, don't challenge the kitchen, don't correct management, and above all, don't protect the wrong people. Naomi had learned how to survive quietly. She was 25 with eyes that carried exhaustion and intelligence in equal measure. Once, she'd imagined courtrooms and law books, justice argued in daylight. But dreams were expensive, and sickness had no patience for ambition. When her mother got ill, Naomi came home. When the bills came faster than hope, she took the first job that didn't ask questions. The cradle paid well for a service job, but it took more than it gave. She was always scheduled for doubles, always given the worst sections, always blamed when something went wrong, even when she hadn't touched it. The jokes in the kitchen weren't jokes to her. The laughter wasn't harmless. She'd learned to watch, to remember. And tonight, something felt off. The man at the table by the service doors didn't fit the usual pattern. He wasn't loud, didn't snap his fingers, didn't act grateful to be there. He watched the room like someone measuring it, like someone looking past appearances. When Naomi finally approached his table, he looked up and met her eyes, really met them. Not through her, not around her. At that moment, something inside. Naomi shifted, because men who saw her like that were rare in this place. "Good evening," she said. "Can I get you anything else while you wait?" "No," he replied gently. "Thank you." Polite, calm, grounded. Naomi walked away, her heart beating just a little faster than before. She didn't know who he was, but she knew one thing with certainty. This man wasn't here to be served. And before the night was over, both of them were going to learn exactly what the cradle was hiding, and how dangerous the truth could be. Every place like the cradle ran on 2 sets of rules. The first was printed neatly on menus and employee handbooks, policies about hospitality, excellence, and tradition. Words that sounded good framed in gold lettering on the wall by the bar. The second set lived in glances, tones, and timing. Naomi had learned those rules within her first week. Rule 1. Some guests were welcomed. Others were tolerated. Rule 2. Mistakes only counted when the wrong people made them. Rule 3. If you wanted to keep your job, you pretended not to notice. The kitchen was where the truth lived. Behind the swinging doors, the warmth of the dining room vanished. Heat slammed into your face. Oil hissed. Pans clanged like warnings. And the language changed. Looser, meaner, careless in ways that cut deep if you let them. Chef Rick ruled the kitchen like a tyrant who mistook cruelty for authority. He was loud, talented enough to be dangerous, and protected by results. Investors loved numbers. Guests loved spectacle. No one asked what happened between order and plate. Naomi stayed invisible when she could, but tonight, invisibility felt heavier. When the order for the presidential steak came through, the kitchen reacted immediately. "Who's that for?" Rick asked, peering at the screen. "Table 14, another cook said. Rick leaned out just enough to see the dining room. His eyes landed on Malcolm. Hoodie, sneakers, seated near the kitchen. Doors. Rick laughed. Not loudly, just enough. "Must be a special occasion," he muttered. Naomi felt it in her chest. She stepped forward. "I'll run it when it's ready." Rick glanced at her. "If it's paid for." "It will be," Naomi said evenly. That earned her a look, not anger. Something worse. Amusement. She turned away before it could sink its teeth in. Out in the dining room, Malcolm waited. He noticed things most people didn't. How the server smiled wider at nearby tables. How the manager lingered just long enough to see if Malcolm would flinch under attention. How the wait time stretched. Not long enough to complain, but long enough to send a message. You are not a priority. Malcolm didn't touch his phone, didn't shift in his chair. He simply observed. This wasn't his first time doing this. Years earlier, before the money, before the suits and interviews, he'd learned how people treated you when they thought you had nothing to offer. How easily respect disappeared when it wasn't enforced by symbols. Symbols like wealth or power. He wondered how many people had come through these doors believing the lie on the website, believing elegance meant safety, believing politeness meant fairness. The steak took longer than usual. When it finally arrived at the prep station, Naomi was already watching. She had seen corners cut before, had seen jokes made that never should have been spoken out loud. But what happened next wasn't subtle. Rick leaned over the sizzling meat, glanced around, and did it. Quick, deliberate. Naomi's breath caught. For a split second, her brain tried to deny it, to soften it into something accidental, something survivable. But the laughter that followed killed the illusion. That's what happens, someone said quietly, when people forget their place. Naomi froze. The steak was plated, finished beautifully, perfect on the outside, poisoned underneath. Her hands trembled as she lifted the plate. Every instinct screamed to stop, to shout, to throw it away. But she knew how this worked. If she made noise, she'd be gone before sunrise. Another name erased from the schedule. Another problem employee quietly removed. Silence was the system's favorite accomplice. She carried the plate halfway toward the dining room before stopping. Her mind raced. If she said nothing, she'd be complicit. If she spoke out loud, she'd be punished. Then she thought of the man at table 14, the way he'd looked at her. Not as staff, as a person. Naomi reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a pen. Her fingers shook as she grabbed a linen napkin and scribbled quickly, the words uneven but clear. She folded it once, twice. Her heart pounded as she walked back into the dining room. Malcolm looked up as she approached. She placed the steak down carefully, lifted the silver dome. The smell rose, rich, indulgent, deceptive. "Enjoy your meal," she said, her voice steady, despite the chaos inside her. Then, as she cleared an empty plate with one hand, she slid the folded napkin beneath the edge of his setting. Their eyes met for half a second. That was all. Naomi walked away. Malcolm sat still. He didn't reach for his knife, didn't taste the food. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the tension in her shoulders as she disappeared behind the kitchen doors. Slowly, he unfolded the napkin. The words were simple, brutal, enough. His smile vanished, not slowly, not politely. It stopped. The room around him continued exactly as before. But Malcolm Devo had just crossed from observer to participant, and somewhere in the kitchen, Naomi Brooks waited for consequences she couldn't yet imagine, hoping she'd chosen the right person to tell the truth to. The smile didn't fade. It collapsed. 1 second, Malcolm was another guest in a quiet corner, a man tolerated but unnoticed. The next, he was stone still, eyes fixed on the napkin in his hand. Like it had weight, like it had changed gravity. They spit in your food. No signature, no explanation, just truth delivered without protection. Malcolm folded the napkin slowly, deliberately, as if rushing might draw attention. His pulse didn't spike in anger. It narrowed, focused, cold, precise. He'd seen corruption before. He'd uncovered fraud, betrayal, backroom deals dressed up as strategy. But this was intimate. This was contempt served hot. He glanced toward the kitchen doors. Naomi had already vanished back into the heat and noise, but he'd seen enough. The tension in her posture, the way she hadn't waited for his reaction. She hadn't wanted gratitude, she'd wanted safety for him and maybe for herself. Malcolm pushed the plate away. The steak sat untouched, a symbol now instead of a meal. He didn't call a waiter, didn't raise his hand. He reached calmly into his pocket and pulled out a phone that looked ordinary, scratched at the edges. Not the device he used for press calls or investor meetings. This one was for moments like this. He typed one sentence. Red flag. Pull kitchen footage tonight. Quiet. Send. Across the room, the manager noticed. Mr. Clay prided himself on reading people. He'd worked in hospitality long enough to recognize discomfort, dissatisfaction, entitlement. But the man at table 14 didn't fit any of his categories. He wasn't complaining. He wasn't eating. He was watching. That unsettled Clay more than anger ever would. He approached with his practiced smile. "Is everything all right, sir?" Malcolm looked up, calm, polite. "I'd like to speak with you privately." The request was measured. Not a threat. Not a plea. Clay hesitated just long enough to reveal instinct. "Of course," he said, "and right this way." The office was small and over-decorated, filled with framed awards and certificates that meant nothing to the people they were supposed to impress. Clay gestured toward a chair. Malcolm didn't sit. "I'd like to see your kitchen camera footage," Malcolm said. "From tonight." Clay blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The footage," Malcolm repeated. "Specifically from the time my order was prepared." Clay chuckled lightly. "Those cameras are for inventory, sir, not now," Malcolm said softly. The word landed heavy. Clay's smile faltered. "May I ask who you are?" Malcolm met his eyes. "I'm the person who decides whether this place survives the year." Silence. Clay swallowed. He turned toward the computer, hands suddenly less confident. He clicked through folders, pulled up grainy clips. The screen flickered. Then, nothing. A jump, a clean cut in the timeline. Malcolm leaned in. "Why does the footage skip right there?" Clay's mouth opened, closed. "System glitch," he said too quickly. Malcolm straightened. "You're done for tonight." Clay stared. "Excuse me?" "Go home," Malcolm said. "And I suggest you call a lawyer." Outside the office, the restaurant continued humming, blissfully unaware. Back in the kitchen, Naomi waited. She replayed the moment again and again, the pen shaking, the napkin sliding across the table. Every sound felt louder now, every glance sharper. She expected someone to come for her. They didn't. When her shift ended, she left without being stopped. That scared her more than confrontation would have. The next morning, Naomi returned, braced for the worst. Instead, she was called into the office. Malcolm was there. Same hoodie, same calm presence. But now she knew, instinctively, that something irreversible had happened. "Naomi Brooks," he said gently. "Please sit." Her legs felt weak. "I saw the footage," he continued, "and what wasn't there?" Her throat tightened. "I didn't know who else to tell." "You told the right person," Malcolm said. She hesitated. "Am I fired?" He shook his head. "No, but some people are." He paused, then added, "I own this restaurant." The words landed slowly. Naomi's breath caught. "I'm shutting it down," Malcolm continued, "and rebuilding it. But I can't do that without someone who understands what went wrong." She stared at him. "Why me?" "Because you chose truth over safety," he said. "And because systems don't change unless the people they hurt are allowed to lead." Naomi looked down, overwhelmed. "What happens now?" she asked. Malcolm smiled, this time not with charm, but with resolve. "Now," he said, "we make sure this never happens again." Outside, the sign above the cradle still gleamed in the morning sun. Inside, the foundation had already begun to crack. By noon, the doors of the cradle were still open, but something inside had shifted. It wasn't visible yet. No alarms, no raised voices, no dramatic announcements. Just a subtle tension in the air, like a storm pressing down before anyone looks at the sky. Malcolm stood across the street in his hotel suite, jacket folded over the back of a chair, eyes fixed on the live feed playing silently on his tablet. Multiple camera angles now filled the screen, unedited, raw, pulled from cloud backups the local system couldn't touch. There it was again, Chef Rick leaning over the steak. No hesitation, no accident, just contempt. Malcolm paused the footage and leaned back, exhaling slowly. He felt no satisfaction, no vindication, only clarity. This wasn't one man's cruelty. It was permission. A culture that taught people like Rick they would never be questioned as long as the dining room stayed polished. He sent another message. Initiate compliance lockdown. Audit staff records. Suspend kitchen operations effective immediately. Then he closed the tablet. Across town, Naomi sat in her car outside the restaurant, hands gripping the steering wheel. She'd been called in early. No explanation. No tone to prepare her. The waiting was worse than any outcome. When she finally walked through the back entrance, conversation stopped. Forks paused mid-clatter. A few heads turned too quickly away. Someone whispered her name. She walked anyway. In the office, Malcolm stood with two people she didn't recognize. Quiet, serious, efficient. One nodded at her. Another typed notes without looking up. "Thank you for coming in early," Malcolm said. "This won't take long." Naomi nodded, bracing herself. "We're closing the restaurant for the day," he continued, effective immediately. Her eyes widened. "Because of me?" "Because of the truth," he corrected. There was a knock at the door. Security. Chef Rick was escorted out first, apron still on, face red with disbelief and rage. He shouted something Naomi didn't catch, but she didn't need to. She'd heard variations of it before. Then Mr. Clay. This time, there was no smile. The dining room emptied quickly after that. Guests murmured. Phones came. Out. The illusion cracked. By mid-afternoon, reporters gathered outside. Malcolm didn't hide. He stepped forward calmly, hands visible, voice steady. "Yesterday," he said, "I visited this restaurant as a customer. What I witnessed was unacceptable. What was uncovered afterward was worse." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't name names yet. "This establishment will remain closed while a full investigation is conducted. There will be consequences." Short, direct, unavoidable. Naomi watched from just behind him, heart racing. She'd never stood this close to power before, not the kind that listened. By evening, her phone buzzed nonstop. Friends, old classmates. A former professor who'd heard her name whispered somewhere in the noise. "Are you okay? Is it true? Did you really?" She turned the phone face down. She wasn't ready to be brave out loud yet. That night, Malcolm sat alone again, this time in his suite, city lights blinking beyond the glass. He thought about the first computer he'd built from donated parts, about his mother scrubbing floors so he could sit in rooms like these one day, and about Naomi. She hadn't known who he was. That mattered. Power revealed truth, but courage did not require recognition. The next morning, Malcolm asked her to meet him, away from the restaurant, away from cameras. They sat across from each other in a quiet cafe. "I want you to help me rebuild this place," he said. Naomi laughed once, softly. "I'm just a waitress." "No," Malcolm replied. "You're someone who understands where systems fail." She hesitated. "People will hate me." "They already do," he said gently. "The difference now is you won't be alone." She stared at her hands. "What does that even look like?" "Training, oversight, accountability," Malcolm said. "And a role with authority, Director of Ethics and Culture." The title sounded unreal. "I don't know if I can—" "You already did," he interrupted. "You just didn't know it yet." Naomi took a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for months. Outside, the cradle sat dark behind locked doors. The silence inside it wasn't hiding anything anymore. It was waiting for something better to take its place. The first thing Naomi learned about truth was that it doesn't arrive gently. It follows you home. It sits in the passenger seat. It waits in your inbox at 3 in the morning. By the time the news broke nationally, Naomi had already stopped answering her phone. She lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun useless circles above her. Every sound outside felt louder now. Every car passing made her flinch. She replayed the night over and over, not the act itself, but the seconds after. The moment the napkin left her fingers, the moment there was no way to take it back. People like to say courage felt empowering. Naomi thought that was a lie. Courage felt lonely. By morning, the story had a name. Headlines called it an incident. Commentators debated intent. Online, strangers who had never worked a service shift in their lives argued about what should and shouldn't have happened. Some called her a hero. Others called her a liar. A few went further. She didn't read those. At 9 a.m., Malcolm called. "Are you safe?" he asked. Not as an executive, as a human being. "I think so," Naomi said. "I didn't expect this part." "No one ever does," Malcolm replied. "That's why silence survives so long." He asked her to come in later, not to the restaurant, but to a temporary office his team had set up downtown. Neutral ground, secure, quiet. When Naomi arrived, the room buzzed with controlled urgency. Lawyers moved between desks. Consultants spoke in low voices. Screens showed timelines, policies, footage. The machinery of consequence had been activated. Naomi felt out of place. She stood near the doorway until Malcolm noticed and waved her over. "You don't have to stay," he said. "You don't owe anyone more than you've already given." She shook her head. "If I walk away now, they'll say it wasn't real." Malcolm studied her for a long moment. "Then sit with me," he said, "and let's make sure they can't." They went through everything, slowly, carefully. Naomi described patterns she'd never said out loud before. Scheduling practices, table assignments, jokes that were never written down but always understood. The way complaints disappeared when the wrong people made them. As she spoke, Malcolm listened. Not like someone waiting to respond, like someone learning. At one point, Naomi stopped mid-sentence. "I should have said something sooner," she whispered. Malcolm shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "You should have been protected sooner." That distinction mattered. By afternoon, the backlash intensified. Former employees came forward. Few anonymously. One on record. Stories lined up too neatly to dismiss. Patterns emerged. The system cracked wider. Still, the noise grew louder. Sponsors pulled back. Shareholders demanded answers. Malcolm's name trended. Praised by some, questioned by others. He didn't flinch. That evening, he held a closed-door meeting with his board. "This is bigger than one restaurant," he told them. "It's about how we define success." Some nodded. Some didn't. One voice pushed back. "You're risking the brand." Malcolm replied evenly, "If the brand survives by hurting people, it doesn't deserve to." The room fell quiet. Afterward, Naomi stood alone by the window, watching the city lights blink on one by one. "I didn't think about this part," she admitted, "about being seen." Malcolm joined her. "Being seen is dangerous," he said. "But invisibility costs more." He told her then, about his grandmother, about the lessons learned watching his mother work twice as hard to be treated half as fairly, about the years he spent believing power alone could fix things. "I was wrong," he said. "Power without courage just preserves what already exists." Naomi swallowed. "What if I fail?" "Then you fail forward," Malcolm replied. "But you won't fail alone." The next day, Malcolm made the announcement. The cradle would not reopen as it was. Leadership would change. Policies would change. Oversight would be permanent. And Naomi Brooks would step into a new role, not as a symbol, but as authority. The reaction was immediate. Support, skepticism, anger. Naomi felt all of it pressed down at once. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. For the first time since she'd left law school, her choices felt aligned with who she wanted to be, not just who she needed to survive. That night, she returned home exhausted. On her kitchen table sat a folded napkin. She'd kept it. She unfolded it carefully, tracing the uneven ink with her finger. Truth didn't erase fear, but it did something quieter and far more dangerous to broken systems. It refused to disappear, and Naomi knew now. There was no going back to who she'd been before, only forward, into whatever came next. If Naomi had learned anything since telling the truth, it was this: systems do not collapse quietly. They push back, hard. The first sign came in the form of a letter, heavy cream paper, legal language, delivered by courier. It accused her of misconduct, of defamation, of violating company protocol. The words were polished, clinical, and designed to intimidate. She read it once, then twice. Her hands shook, but she didn't cry. She forwarded it to Malcolm. His reply came less than a minute later. Already handled. You're protected. Protection, Naomi was learning, didn't mean peace. It meant standing in the open while storms gathered. By the end of the week, the noise had shifted. The story was no longer just about a restaurant. Commentators debated cancel culture. Talking heads argued about intent versus impact. Anonymous accounts dissected Naomi's past like it was evidence in a trial she never asked for. Someone leaked her old college photo. Someone else questioned her grades. It was astonishing how quickly people tried to make her credibility the issue, rather than the act itself. Malcolm saw it too. They're trying to exhaust you, he said during one of their late-night calls. That's how systems survive. They don't disprove the truth, they bury the person who told it. Naomi leaned back on her couch, phone pressed to her ear. I don't know if I'm built for this. You are, Malcolm said. You just didn't know it came with this price. The investigation moved forward anyway. Compliance teams descended, employment records were pulled. Anonymous reporting channels lit up with stories that mirrored Naomi's almost word for word, different dates, different names, same pattern. The evidence stacked. Still, resistance remained. At a closed meeting with senior leadership, one executive spoke carefully, choosing words like landmines. We need to be mindful of optics, he said. Public perception matters, Malcolm replied without raising his voice. So does reality. Another added, if we make Naomi the face of this, it could backfire. Malcolm's gaze hardened. She's not the face. She's the authority. That ended the discussion. A week later, Naomi stepped into the temporary office that now bore her name on the door, Director of Ethics and Culture. The title felt too big, like a coat borrowed from someone else's life. She set her bag down and took a slow breath. This wasn't about proving herself. It was about building something that couldn't hide. Her first decision surprised everyone, including Malcolm. She asked to meet the staff, all of them. No press, no scripts, no podium. Just chairs arranged in a circle in the closed dining room of the Cradle. When they gathered, some avoided her eyes. Some looked relieved. A few looked angry. She recognized the fear behind all of it. I'm not here to punish anyone, Naomi began, and I'm not here to protect anyone either. The room stilled. I'm here to make sure silence is no longer safer than honesty. She told them her story, not as a performance, but as a map. She named the patterns, the pressure, the unspoken rules. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't soften. Then she did something unexpected. She invited them to speak. At first, no one did. Then a dishwasher raised his hand, quietly. Then another server. Then someone Naomi hadn't expected, an older line cook who'd been there longer than anyone else. It's been like this for years, he said. We just learned to survive it. Naomi nodded. Survival isn't the same as dignity. By the end of the meeting, the room felt different. Not healed, not fixed, but open. Outside the building, the backlash continued. But inside, something irreversible had begun. That night, Malcolm reviewed the restructuring plan Naomi had drafted. It was thorough, uncomfortable, uncompromising. He smiled, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. "You're going to make enemies," he told her. She nodded. "I already have." The next morning, charges were filed. Not quietly. Chef Rick was arrested. So was another supervisor. Evidence of tampering, harassment, and repeated misconduct made denial impossible. Cameras flashed. Headlines shifted. The narrative changed. This was no longer about one note. It was about accountability. Naomi watched the news from her office, heart pounding. She expected relief to wash over her. It didn't. Instead, she felt something steadier. Resolve. Later that afternoon, Malcolm stopped by. "You did this the right way," he said. Naomi shook her head. "We did." He smiled. "Fair enough." As he turned to leave, she called out, "Malcolm?" "Yes?" "Why didn't you walk away? You could have shut this down quietly, saved yourself the trouble." He paused. "Because," he said, "if I had ignored that note, I would have deserved every system I claimed to rise above." After he left, Naomi sat alone in the quiet office. She thought about how close she'd come to saying nothing, how easy it would have been. The system had pushed back, but it hadn't won. And for the first time since the night she picked up that pen, Naomi allowed herself to believe that truth, when protected and acted upon, could do more than expose what was broken. It could build something better. Justice did not arrive with sirens. It arrived with binders, signatures, and people who finally had to answer questions they'd avoided for years. The morning the charges became public, Naomi arrived at the office early. The city outside was already awake, but inside the building, everything felt suspended, like the air before a verdict. She set her bag down, straightened the folder on her desk, and stood for a long moment, just breathing. She used to think justice was loud. Courtrooms, gavel strikes, shouting matches where truth won by volume. What she was seeing now was quieter and far more permanent. By 10 a.m., regulators filled the conference room. Labor officials, health inspectors, compliance auditors, people who did not care about charm or reputation, only records and patterns. They asked precise questions and waited patiently for honest answers. Naomi gave them both. She didn't editorialize. She didn't perform. She told them what she'd seen, when she'd seen it, and how long it had gone on. She described systems, not personalities, structures, not rumors. That mattered. Across town, former managers hired attorneys. Statements were released. Apologies appeared, carefully worded, legally safe, emotionally empty. Some tried to frame the situation as misunderstanding. Others blamed culture without naming who had built it. None of it held. By afternoon, the company announced settlements for affected employees and customers, counseling resources, legal support, a public commitment to independent oversight. But what made the difference wasn't the announcement. It was who delivered it. Malcolm stood beside Naomi at the press conference. Not in front of her. "This didn't come from me," he said plainly. "It came from someone who had far less to lose and chose to act anyway." Naomi felt the weight of cameras and microphones, but she didn't shrink. She spoke when asked, not to justify herself, but to name what mattered. "Accountability isn't punishment," she said. "It's responsibility. And responsibility only works when it's shared." The crowd listened. That evening, the news cycle moved on to the next crisis, as it always did. Naomi expected to feel forgotten. Instead, her inbox filled with messages from servers in other cities, from students reconsidering quitting school, from people who'd stayed quiet for years because they thought no one would listen. She read every one. The next phase began without ceremony. Training programs were rewritten, leadership roles were restructured, anonymous reporting tools were launched, and actually protected, hiring practices changed. The walls of the cradle were stripped of portraits that told only one version of history and replaced with art that reflected the community outside its doors. None of it was symbolic. All of it was structural. Malcolm watched the transformation from a distance, stepping in only when asked. He knew when leadership meant presence, and when it meant restraint. One evening, as Naomi stayed late reviewing policy drafts, he stopped by her office. "You're changing more than a restaurant," he said. She smiled tiredly. "I hope so." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you miss law school?" She considered the question. "I miss the idea of it," she said, "but this feels like law in real time." Malcolm nodded. "If you ever want to go back, the offer stands." Naomi laughed softly. "Careful, I might take you up on that." Outside, construction crews worked late into the night. The building that once hid cruelty behind elegance was being rebuilt from the inside out, wiring exposed, walls open, no place left to hide rot. Weeks later, Naomi walked through the space alone. The dining room was quieter now, stripped of pretense. Sunlight poured through the windows. For the first time, it felt honest. She paused near the table where it had all begun, the corner by the kitchen doors. She remembered the weight of the plate, the tremor in her hand, the decision that changed everything. She reached into her bag and pulled out the napkin. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still legible. She folded it carefully and placed it back where it belonged, in her wallet, not as a relic, but as a reminder. Justice wasn't abstract anymore. It had shape, it had cost, and it had changed her. As she turned off the lights and locked the door behind her, Naomi knew the hardest part wasn't exposing what was wrong. It was committing to what came after. And this time, she wasn't doing it alone. The night before reopening, Naomi couldn't sleep. She lay awake on her couch, laptop open on her chest, rereading policies she already knew by heart. Whistleblower protections, escalation pathways, oversight committees with real authority, not decorative titles. Every clause had been argued, revised, and stress-tested. Still, her mind wouldn't rest, because tomorrow the doors would open again. And opening doors, she'd learned, was the most dangerous part. It wasn't fear of failure that kept her awake. It was something deeper, fear of disappointment, fear that no matter how carefully they rebuilt, people would expect perfection. That one mistake would be used as proof that change had never been real, that she had never been real. At midnight, her phone buzzed. "Malcolm, you awake?" She smiled faintly and typed back, "Unfortunately." A moment later, her phone rang. "I couldn't sleep either," Malcolm admitted. "Thought it might help to hear another human voice." They sat in shared silence for a moment. Two people separated by miles, but bound by a decision neither of them could undo. "Do you remember the first time you realized power didn't protect you?" Naomi asked. Malcolm exhaled. "I was 23, boardroom full of men twice my age. They smiled, nodded, then voted against my proposal without discussion. Later, one of them pulled me aside and said, 'You're impressive, for someone like you.'" Naomi winced. "What did you do?" "I learned," he said. "I learned how to win in rooms that never planned to let me belong. But I also learned how easy it was to forget the people still locked outside." Naomi stared at the ceiling. "I don't want to forget." "You won't," Malcolm said, "because forgetting requires comfort, and you've never been comfortable here." The call ended with no grand advice, no final reassurance, just understanding. Morning came anyway. Naomi arrived at the cradle before sunrise. The building looked different in daylight, less dramatic, more honest. Construction dust still clung to the corners, but the air felt clean, open. Staff began to arrive quietly, some nervous, some hopeful, some skeptical. Naomi greeted them all the same, not as a savior, as a steward. At 9 sharp, she gathered them in the dining room. "This isn't a relaunch," Yes, she said. It's a responsibility. She outlined expectations clearly, not ideals, standards. What would happen when someone spoke up? What would happen when someone crossed a line? Who would listen? Who would act? She ended with one sentence. No one here is invisible anymore. The doors opened at noon. The first guests entered cautiously, like people stepping into a place they weren't sure they trusted yet. Naomi watched from the side as servers moved through the room, different posture, different energy. Not perfect, but aware. At one table sat a black couple holding hands, laughing softly. At another, a family with children pointing at the art on the walls, art that finally reflected the city outside. Naomi felt something loosen in her chest. Then it happened. A server approached her, eyes wide, voice low. Naomi, there's an issue at table 7. Her stomach dropped. Tell me, she said, already moving. At table 7 sat a man with money written all over him, tailored suit, expensive watch, entitlement in his posture. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. This service is slow, he said loudly, and frankly, I'm not impressed. Naomi nodded. I'm sorry to hear that. What seems to be the issue? He glanced at her, dismissive. I asked for the manager. I am, she replied. Calmly, he scoffed. No offense, but I mean the real manager. The room seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment. Not a crisis manufactured by cruelty behind closed doors, but a test in public. Naomi felt eyes on her. Staff, guests, history. She didn't raise her voice. You're speaking to the person responsible for how this place operates, she said. If there's a concern, I'm here to address it. He smirked. Look, I don't care who you are. I just want competent service. Naomi leaned in slightly, not confrontational, not submissive. Competence includes respect, she said, and we provide both here. If that doesn't work for you, I can arrange for your check and wish you a good afternoon. Silence. The man blinked, clearly unaccustomed to being offered an exit instead of appeasement. He glanced around. No one rushed to defend him. No manager hovered to smooth things over. After a long moment, he waved a hand dismissively. Fine, whatever. Naomi straightened. Thank you. We'll take care of the delay. She walked away, heart pounding, but steady. Behind her, the room exhaled. The rest of the day passed without incident. Not perfect, but real. That evening, as the last guests left and chairs were stacked, Naomi stood alone in the dining room again. This time, Malcolm joined her. You handled that well, he said. She laughed quietly. I was terrified. That's how you know it mattered. They walked through the space together, no speeches, no cameras. Just two people surveying the work of many hands. I used to think leadership was about control, Malcolm said. Now I think it's about creating conditions where the right thing is easier to do than the wrong one. Naomi nodded. And making sure the cost of truth isn't higher than the cost of silence. He smiled. Exactly. As Malcolm left, Naomi returned to her office. She opened her drawer and placed the folded napkin inside. Not hidden, not displayed, just kept, because the future didn't need monuments, it needed memory. And Naomi Brooks, once a waitress taught to survive quietly, had become someone who understood something systems feared most. Change doesn't ask for permission. It just walks in, tells the truth, and refuses to leave. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Naomi learned something no headline ever captured. After the investigations ended, after the court dates were scheduled, after the cameras moved on, what remained wasn't applause. It was responsibility. The cradle no longer felt like a stage. It felt like work, real work. Systems required tending. Policies needed enforcement. People needed listening to, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was inconvenient, especially then. Naomi arrived early most mornings, unlocking the front doors herself before the staff arrived. It wasn't symbolic. It grounded her. It reminded her that power didn't live in titles. It lived in access. Who opened doors? Who closed them? Who decided who belonged inside? Some days were quiet. Other days were not. A server filed a complaint about a supervisor who spoke differently to certain staff. Naomi investigated. Evidence backed it up. The supervisor was disciplined. No cover-ups. No whispered second chances. Word spread. Silence stopped being the safer option. That didn't make Naomi popular. It made her necessary. One afternoon, as Naomi reviewed a quarterly report, a familiar name appeared in her inbox. A law school administrator. Howard University. She stared at the email for a long moment before opening it. Your application for re-enrollment. Her hands trembled. Not with fear this time, but with something close to disbelief. She had filled out the forms weeks earlier, almost as a dare to herself. She hadn't expected an answer so soon. She was accepted. Part-time, flexible schedule. She sat back in her chair, laughing softly to no one. Life had a way of returning the dreams you thought you'd buried, if you were willing to carry their weight differently. That evening, Naomi told Malcolm. He smiled, not surprised. I told you the offer wasn't a courtesy. I don't know how I'll balance everything, she admitted. You already are, he replied. You just don't call it balance yet. Malcolm had changed too. He visited the cradle less frequently now, trusting the systems in place. When he did come, he sat wherever there was space. No special treatment, no announcements. He wanted to see how the place functioned without him. It functioned. Not flawlessly, but honestly. One night, Malcolm took the same seat by the kitchen doors, where he'd sat months earlier. This time, a candle waited on the table. A small thing. A deliberate thing. Naomi noticed from across the room. She didn't go over. Not immediately. Because this wasn't about him anymore. Later, when the dinner rush slowed, she joined him. Do you ever think about that night? She asked. All the time, Malcolm said. Not because of what happened. Because of how close it came to not happening. Naomi nodded. I almost said nothing. And I almost never would have known, he said quietly. They sat in silence for a moment. People think change is dramatic, Naomi said, but it's really just repetition, doing the right thing again and again even when no one's watching. Malcolm smiled. That's the part that scares systems the most. The following week, a former employee came in during lunch hours. A young woman Naomi remembered. Someone who'd quit suddenly months before the investigation. She stood near the entrance, uncertain. Naomi walked over immediately. I heard things changed, the woman said cautiously. They did, Naomi replied. But you don't have to take my word for it. The woman looked around, the diverse staff, the relaxed atmosphere, the absence of fear in the room. I want my job back, she said. Naomi didn't hesitate. Let's talk. Moments like that didn't make the news. They mattered more. Late one evening, Naomi sat alone in her office, reviewing a draft of a new ethics framework she planned to share with other restaurants under Malcolm's company. If it worked here, it could work elsewhere. Scale wasn't the enemy. Carelessness was. She reached into her drawer and took out the napkin. The ink had faded more now, but the words were still readable. She remembered the fear in her chest that night. The certainty that whatever happened next would be irreversible. She'd been right. Irreversible didn't mean destructive. It meant honest. Naomi folded the napkin carefully and placed it back. Not as evidence, as origin. Outside, the restaurant buzzed with quiet life. Dishes clinked. Laughter rose and fell. People eating without suspicion. Staff working without dread. Normalcy reclaimed. Before leaving, Naomi walked through the dining room one last time, turning off lights table by table. When she reached the corner by the kitchen doors, she paused. She didn't sit. She didn't linger. She nodded once, to the space, to the memory, to the person she used to be. And then she walked out. Across the city, Malcolm stood on his balcony, watching the skyline glow against the night. His phone buzzed with updates, invitations, requests. He ignored them for a moment. He thought about leadership, not as dominance, not as image, but as responsibility that outlived attention. He had built companies before. This time, he had helped build something harder. Trust. The world didn't change overnight. It never did. But somewhere in Charleston, a restaurant served food without cruelty. Somewhere a woman studied law again, not because she needed permission, but because she had claimed her place. And somewhere else, someone watched something wrong happen and remembered a story about a napkin, a note, and a choice. Sometimes that was enough to start. Not a fire, a future.